A girl came home from school and stayed alone for just a few minutes, but when her parents returned, she was already gone without a trace. Police and volunteers searched for weeks, but it was as if she had vanished into thin air. Then, out of nowhere, a shocking twist in the case sparked a series of events that captivated the entire country. Ultimately, this case became one of the most high-profile and controversial in Canadian history, and its impact is still felt today. Christine Jessop was born on November 29, 1974, in the small Canadian town of Queensville. It was a quiet and peaceful place, located not far from a picturesque lake. With a population of only about 600 people, Queensville was considered very safe, and many residents knew each other well. Christine lived there with her parents and brother, who was 5 years older than her. She loved spending time outside with friends, riding her bike, and playing baseball. Christine also had a great love for animals. Once, a bat flew into her room, and unlike her family, she wasn't scared at all. Instead, she said she wanted to keep it as a pet. On October 3, 1984, when Christine was 9 years old, she woke up early as usual and started getting ready for school. Her brother had a toothache, so their mother planned to take him to the dentist in Toronto. This meant that after school, Christine would be home alone until they returned. Despite her age, Christine had stayed home unsupervised many times before. Her parents weren't too worried, as she was very independent and could take care of herself. Before leaving school that day, Christine agreed to meet her best friend after they both got home. She then took the school bus, which dropped her off just a few hundred yards from her house. A few minutes later, Christine's friend arrived at the park where they had planned to meet and began waiting for her. But as time passed, there was still no sign of Christine. Her friend waited a bit longer, then decided to go home. She tried calling Christine, but no one answered. Meanwhile, Christine's mom and brother returned home. The mom quickly realized that her daughter wasn't there, even though it was clear she had come home after school. Her backpack was in her room, and the mail from the mailbox was in the hallway. She also noticed a few strange things. Christine's bike was laying outside, and its kickstand was damaged. Christine loved that bike and always took good care of it, so it was surprising that she would just leave it outside like that. Christine's jacket was also hanging on a high hook in the hallway, a place she clearly couldn't reach on her own. But despite all of this, her mom wasn't initially worried. She thought Christine had just gone out to play, like she had many times before, and decided to wait for her to come back. About an hour later, as it started to get dark outside, her mom began to worry. Even though Christine was independent, she always let her parents know where she was going. Her mom started calling the parents of all of Christine's friends, hoping she was with one of them. But each time, she was told that no one had seen Christine since school. When her mom called Christine's best friend, the girl said they had planned to meet in the park, but Christine never showed up. Realizing that none of her friends had seen Christine, the mother and her son headed out to search the streets. Given the small size of their town, they quickly checked all the places Christine liked to spend time, but she was nowhere to be found. By around 7 p.m., with no sign of her and still no word, the mother decided it was time to call the police. For the local police department, cases like this weren't all that uncommon. Usually, they involved kids who either lost track of time while playing or ran off after a fight with their parents. In most of these situations, the kids were found quickly, without the need for a full investigation. This time, the police organized a search and asked locals for help. Dozens quickly responded and went out to look for Christine. The police also found out that Christine had visited a small store located between her house and the park where she was supposed to meet her friend. She bought some gum, but where she went after that remained a mystery. There were no surveillance cameras back then, so the officers couldn't piece together an exact timeline. They believed she had gone to the store just minutes after getting home from school. The search continued through the night, but they were unable to find Christine. The next day, even more people joined the search efforts, and the police began receiving various tips. However, none of them proved useful. Most reports were of people seeing some girl on the street or in a passing car, but no one was sure it was Christine, and they also couldn't provide any additional details. In the following days, the police began to suspect they were dealing with an abduction. There was little chance Chelsea could go unnoticed when every resident in their small town knew about her disappearance. Her mother was also certain that Christine would never run away from home. Despite this, the police still couldn't locate Christine. They searched her house, but due to their lack of experience, they did it quite unprofessionally. They looked through some of her belongings without dusting for fingerprints. Plus, they allowed neighbors and family friends to visit the house before conducting a proper examination, potentially compromising any evidence. It's worth noting that at the time of Christine's disappearance, her father was in jail. Just a few weeks earlier, he had received a small sentence for a minor fraud, and on the day Christine went missing, her mother and brother had visited him after the dentist appointment. When it became clear that Christine was likely abducted, her father was released from jail to be with his family, and he immediately joined the search for his daughter. The search continued for several weeks, but they were unable to find Christine or any clues that could shed light on her disappearance. The search area expanded to cover the fields and forests surrounding the town, but still, nothing turned up. This went on for 3 months, until December 31st. While everyone else was getting ready to celebrate the new year, Christine's family had no reason to celebrate. They still held on to hope that she was alive, but that hope was fading. On that day, a man from the town of Sunderland, 35 miles from Queensville, went out to look for his runaway dog. Walking through the wooded area behind his house, he noticed what looked like a small pile of trash and went closer. To his horror, he discovered a human body and immediately returned home to call the police. When officers arrived at the scene, they quickly identified the deceased, even though the body was in an advanced state of decomposition. Lying next to it was a recorder with a piece of paper labeled Christine Jessop. The recorder had been given to Christine at school on the day she disappeared. Officers immediately suspected foul play. Part of her clothing, including her pants and underwear, was found next to the body, while her other clothes were still on her. The body was sent to medical examiners, and the Queensville police reclassified the case as a homicide. Christine had multiple stab wounds, which were determined to be the cause of death, along with numerous abrasions. Experts concluded that she had been assaulted and found foreign biological material on her underwear. However, since DNA analysis wasn't available at the time, this evidence couldn't be used to identify the perpetrator. Investigators believe that Christine was killed elsewhere and then transported to the location where her body was found. They considered it odd that the killer drove 35 miles to leave her body near another town, especially with so many fields and forests around Queensville. Detectives theorized that the killer might have had some connection to Sunderland and chose that spot because he was familiar with it. They were also nearly certain that the perpetrator lived in Queensville and knew Christine, as all signs suggested she might have willingly gone with him or gotten into his car. Investigators repeatedly asked Christine's parents if they had any suspects in mind, but her mother always said she couldn't think of anyone in particular. The police interviewed nearly every resident of the town, investigated several individuals with criminal histories, and followed up on various tips, but they couldn't connect any of them to the crime. This continued until February 14th, when detectives returned to speak with Christine's mother again. They asked her once more if she could think of anyone who seemed suspicious, and this time she remembered something odd. The Morans family lived next door and were well respected in the town. The head of the family owned a small business and was known for being able to fix almost anything. The residents of Queensville often sought his help, and he was well regarded. He had 6 adult children who helped run the business. One of them, 25-year-old Guy Paul Moran, lived with his parents, and Christine's mother remembered a few strange things about him. Guy Paul hadn't participated in the search for Christine, even though almost the entire town had joined the efforts for weeks. And after Christine's body was found, he didn't attend her funeral, despite being the family's closest neighbor. She added that Guy Paul was quiet and reserved. He had a few friends and a girlfriend, but unlike the rest of his family, he kept to himself. He was also passionate about playing the clarinet. This detail caught the detective's attention, as Christine had a recorder with her at the time of the abduction. They speculated that Guy Paul might have used music to engage Christine in conversation and lure her away. Moreover, Christine would have known him, as he had lived just a few yards from their home all her life. Detectives went to speak with him and asked how well he knew Christine. Guy Paul said they had hardly ever spoken, except for one time when her dog ran away, and he helped her catch it. When asked where he was on the day Christine disappeared, Guy Paul said he was at work, 30 miles away, until about 3:30 p.m. He then drove to the store, stopped at a gas station, and got home around 5 p.m. Finally, the detective asked what he thought about Christine. He replied that she was a typical sweet child, but then added an odd remark: "But sometimes they grow up to be corrupt." This struck the police as very suspicious, so they began verifying his alibi. Detectives checked his work schedule and found that he finished his shift at exactly 3:32 p.m. That meant even if he had driven straight to Christine's house, he wouldn't have arrived before her mother got home. Further checks confirmed that he had indeed stopped at a grocery store and a gas station, which took about half an hour. His family also confirmed that he arrived home around 5 p.m. and went to bed shortly after because he was tired from work. Based on all this, it simply seemed he didn't have enough time to abduct Christine. However, investigators considered that his family might have been mistaken about when he got home, or even covering for him. Detectives asked to search his car and found several fabric fibers in the trunk, which were sent to the lab. Experts soon came to the conclusion that these fibers matched the sweater Christine was wearing the day she disappeared. Several hairs found on Christine's body were also believed to belong to Morin. However, in those days, experts could only visually compare hair samples and suggest similarities or obvious differences, like color. Finally, the police consulted an FBI profiler who created a rough profile of the killer based on all available information. The profiler suggested that the suspect was a male from Queensville, aged 19 to 26, with a criminal record for crimes like arson or voyeurism. The profiler provided other characteristics, but detectives focused only on those that matched Morin. He had no criminal record or a bad reputation, so he fit less than half of the profile's criteria. But the police were already convinced Morin was the killer, and on April 22nd, they decided to arrest him. He denied any involvement in the crime and was placed in jail awaiting trial. Christine's parents were shocked to learn that their closest neighbor could commit such a crime. However, the detective's main problem was Christine's mother's statement about the exact time she returned home, 4:10 p.m. She was confident about this because she checked the clock as soon as she entered the kitchen. According to the investigators' calculations, Morin couldn't have reached their house from his workplace before 4:10 p.m. and would have needed at least another 15 to 20 minutes. So, they kept asking the woman if she was sure about the time or if she might be mistaken. They insisted that Paul was the killer, and only her testimony about the time prevented them from holding Morin accountable. Eventually, the woman assumed that she might have arrived a little later, and that was enough for the police. During the trial, the prosecution attempted to portray Morin as a strange loner whose behavior raised concerns among the other town residents. They also insisted that he had enough time to abduct Christine, as her mother arrived home later than she initially stated. Regarding Guy Paul's family members who confirmed his alibi, a psychologist brought in by the prosecution claimed they all showed signs of covering for him. A key moment at the trial was the testimony of an undercover officer who had been placed in Morin's cell while he awaited trial. According to the officer, Morin mentioned specific details about the crime, such as the cause of death. However, this information had been reported in the newspapers, so Morin wasn't revealing anything new. He also said to his cellmate that his favorite movie was The Shining and responded to some of his questions with quotes from the film. Although Morin maintained his innocence, the undercover officer's testimony had a significant impact on the trial. Combined with the prosecution's efforts to portray him as a strange and dangerous individual, it further solidified the negative image of Guy Paul in the eyes of the jury. But despite all of this, the prosecution's evidence was deemed questionable. and ultimately, the jury did not find it sufficient for a conviction. Morin was found not guilty and released from the courtroom. The prosecution immediately announced plans to appeal, insisting that they still believed in Morin's guilt. Christine's family was once again devastated. They faced the reality of living just yards away from the man they believed was responsible for their daughter's murder. Her father added that they had been living in hell since her death, and now that hell would go on. Queensville residents were also unhappy with the verdict. Many people believed Guy Paul was the killer and did not want him living among them. When he returned home, someone repeatedly filled their mailbox with threatening letters, and some people even threw various objects at their house. Meanwhile, the prosecution worked on their appeal. They argued that the judge in the first trial hadn't clearly explained the concept of reasonable doubt to the jury, and that was enough for a higher court to schedule a new trial. It began in 1991, several years after the murder. During the preparations, the public learned a few interesting facts. It was revealed that the expert who matched the fabric fibers from Morin's car to the victim's sweater had worn a sweater of the same color and material during the comparison. However, by the time of the second trial, much of the evidence she worked with had simply disappeared, including the fabric fibers and several hairs found on the victim's body or clothing. But that wasn't all. Several of Christine's bones and a cigarette butt found near her body were also missing. It turned out that this cigarette butt had never been added to the case materials, possibly because Morin never smoked. Despite all these alarming issues, the new trial was on its way. This time, the prosecution's main theory was that Morin saw the recorder in Christine's hands when she came back from school, took out his clarinet, and started playing. Hearing the music, Christine approached his car, and Morin forced her inside, drove her to an unknown location, and killed her. Although this theory was admittedly weak, in July 1992, the jury reached a unanimous decision. They found Guy Paul guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. But this time, public opinion shifted dramatically. Initially, the media portrayed Morin as a strange and dangerous loner, but after learning about all the investigators' mistakes, the narrative changed completely. The media began to suggest that Morin might be innocent and a victim of sheer incompetence. After the verdict, a group of concerned citizens band together to challenge the court's decision. In light of this pressure, Morin's lawyer filed an appeal for a new trial, and Morin was released from prison on bail. Such a move was quite rare, but the widespread public outcry played a crucial role. But there were significant challenges. The bail was set at around $500,000, forcing Morin's parents to mortgage their home. This was their only option to raise that amount of money. The lawyer requested a DNA analysis of the victim's underwear, which still contained a biological sample. Previous attempts to analyze it had been unsuccessful due to the limited technology of the time. However, by the mid-90s, advances in forensic science allowed experts to extract a DNA profile from the semen found on the fabric. The results conclusively showed that the DNA did not match Guy Paul's. This revelation sparked outrage across Canada. Morin had spent a total of 1.5 years in prison and went through several years of trials, so his life was basically ruined. All of this was due to the actions of police officers who focused on framing him rather than seeking the truth. In January 1995, 10 years after Christine's body was discovered, all charges against Morin were dropped, and he was declared a free man. He later sued the authorities and was awarded $1.2 million. Some investigators who had fabricated evidence against him faced legal consequences or lost their jobs. This case also led to some of the most significant reforms in Canada's legal system, aimed at preventing such miscarriages of justice in the future. After Morin's release, authorities decided to reopen the investigation into Christine's murder, forming a new team of detectives. With the DNA sample of the real killer in hand, they focused on collecting samples from anyone who could have potentially committed the crime. They gathered DNA from several hundred men, but there was no match. Since then, the case has seen little progress. It was handed over to the Cold Case Unit, which reviewed it from time to time, but they also couldn't find new suspects. A significant challenge was that the original team of detectives not only lost some evidence, but also failed to conduct a thorough investigation at the time. They were so convinced that Guy Paul was the perpetrator that they didn't even consider other potential suspects. Canadian media continued to cover the case, and after one specific publication in a major news outlet, journalists received several interesting leads. One man claimed his father had confessed to Christine's murder on his deathbed, while others pointed to individuals with questionable reputations who lived in Queensville at the time. The journalists passed all this information to the police, but none of the suspects could be definitively linked to the murder. In 2019, 35 years after the murder, the case was reopened again, this time with a new detective assigned to it. With only the perpetrator's DNA sample in his hands, he decided to try a relatively new method, genetic genealogy. Since there were no laboratories in Canada specializing in such complex and innovative work, the detective had to contact a company in the United States and secure funding from his boss. Eventually, his request was approved, and the experts began searching for the criminal's relatives using publicly available DNA databases. They identified several individuals who were distant relatives of the DNA sample's owner, but investigating their family trees could have taken years. The experts then decided to cross-reference information about all these distant relatives, which allowed them to narrow down their search. Ultimately, they concluded that the police would need to examine the family trees of around 400 people to find the DNA sample's owner. With all this data, the detective reached out to a colleague in Canada with extensive experience in DNA analysis. The colleague agreed to assist with the investigation and began reconstructing the family trees of those individuals. He decided not to share any details with the detective to prevent bias or the possibility of misleading him while considering the potential involvement of anyone who might come up as a suspect. The specialist and his colleagues worked on this task for 8 months, methodically studying various family trees until they focused on one in particular. The older one of this tree was a man born in 1804, and the experts carefully examined hundreds of his descendants. In October 2020, they identified one specific family and finally narrowed it down to a single name that fit all the criteria of the most likely killer, Calvin Hoover. When they shared this information with the detective, he did not recognize the name. Hoover had not appeared in any case files or in the thousands of leads gathered over 3 decades. The detective began to investigate this individual, and soon he was met with a shocking surprise. It turned out that Hoover was one of Christine's parents' closest friends. At the time of the murder, Calvin Hoover was 28 years old and lived in Queensville with his wife and children. Christine's parents had been friends with his family for a long time, and Hoover was even listed as their emergency contact. Moreover, just a few days before the tragedy, Christine's mother had visited them. During that visit, she told Hoover's wife that she would be going to see her husband in prison with her son after a dental appointment, but she wouldn't be bringing Christine because she was too young for such a place. This meant that Hoover's wife was aware that Christine would be home alone on a specific day and at a specific time, and Hoover himself, who was also at home, could have overheard this. Christine also knew Hoover well and would have had no hesitation getting into his car or going with him, as he was a close friend of her parents. The detective then wondered why Hoover's name hadn't come up in the case files if he was so close to the family. Upon further investigation, he uncovered another interesting fact. After the body was found, the police had spoken to Hoover's wife, who mentioned that she wasn't at home at the time of Christine's disappearance. However, she added that her husband was at home looking after their small children. Apparently, the police were satisfied with his wife's account and accepted it as an alibi for Hoover, without bothering to question the man himself. This meant that Hoover had the opportunity to commit the crime, and the detective only needed to confirm his guilt. But there was another big issue. Hoover had died in 2015 after struggling with some serious health problems. The detective, who still needed a direct DNA sample from Hoover, began to consider his options. Cases of such deaths were not always investigated thoroughly, and even if the body had been exhumed, there might not have been any biological samples left after 5 years. However, he got lucky. When he contacted the medical experts who had examined Hoover's body, they informed him that they still had 2 vials of his blood. The samples were promptly sent to the lab, and experts extracted a DNA profile from the blood. When they compared it to the killer's profile, they found a complete match. Hoover was indeed the one who was responsible for Christine's death. Christine's parents were shocked by this news, as they had never suspected that their close friend could be the killer all these years. They were also frustrated that he had lived his life with a family and children without facing any consequences for his actions. Hoover's relatives were also stunned when the police informed them of his involvement in Christine's murder. His wife said she had never even considered that her husband could be connected to the case in any way. Paul Morin told reporters that the discovery of the real killer changed nothing for him. He spent about 10 years between prison and courtrooms, and after all the charges were dropped, many people continued to believe he was the murderer. He added that he lived in constant fear for all those years, a fear that still haunts him to this day. He stated that this case not only destroyed Christine's life, but also his own. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.